I was jolted awake by the sound of someone yelling. Not just anyone, Karen. The self-appointed ruler of our neighborhood HOA. She was standing at the edge of my property, face redder than a stop sign, absolutely losing it. And the best part? Her shiny new luxury SUV was stuck right in the middle of a giant trench I had legally dug around my driveway. A trench complete with a functioning, medieval-style drawbridge that I could raise or lower whenever I pleased. But let's rewind about 2 weeks, because none of this would have made sense back then. At that point, I was just a regular homeowner, trying to enjoy some peace and quiet, maybe grill a few steaks on the weekend. But peace doesn't exist when you live next to a power-tripping HOA president. Karen acted like she ran a kingdom, not a cul-de-sac. She'd measure grass with a ruler, issue fines over a non-approved shade of beige, and send threatening letters if your car had a smudge on it. I'd put up with her nonsense before, but I never thought it would turn into full-blown war. It all started one morning when I walked outside, coffee in hand, and saw Karen's massive SUV parked directly across my driveway. At first, I assumed it was a mistake, maybe she'd stopped for a second. But no, there she was, standing on the sidewalk with her arms folded and that smug look she always wore when she was about to ruin someone's day. "Morning, Karen," I said, trying to stay polite. "You're blocking my driveway." She smiled like a cat with a cornered mouse. "Oh, I know," she said sweetly. "It's HOA business. We've received some complaints about your driveway." I blinked. "Complaints? From who?" "That's confidential," she replied with a wave. "But we've decided your driveway isn't up to HOA standards." I looked down at the driveway. Concrete. Solid. Completely ordinary. "That's ridiculous," I said. "There's nothing wrong with it." Karen gave me that fake sympathetic look. "Unfortunately, the board has the final say. Until we complete a full review, I'll need to leave my car here to prevent any further infractions." I stared at her, waiting for her to say she was joking. "Nope," she chirped, pulling out a clipboard and jotting something down. "Oh, and if you try to tow my car, that'll be considered harassment. HOA policy." I wanted to argue. I really did. But I knew Karen, she thrived on drama. If I lost my cool, she'd report me in a heartbeat and hit me with even more violations. So I swallowed my frustration, nodded, and went back inside. The next few days were a nightmare. Every morning, her car was still there, mocking me. The HOA ignored my calls. The tow companies refused to help, quoting some vague community agreement. Karen strutted around like she'd won a prize. And to add insult to injury, I started getting fined. Apparently, not using my driveway, because it was blocked, was considered neglecting maintenance. Every time I checked my mailbox, there was another letter demanding payment. I was beyond angry. But I wasn't about to roll over and let her win. If Karen wanted a fight, I was going to give her one, by playing smarter. I spent the next few nights doing what I do best, research. If the HOA was going to use rules as weapons, I was going to find my own legal loophole. And after hours buried in zoning laws and municipal codes, I found it, a single sentence that changed everything. The local ordinances said nothing prohibited security upgrades to private property, so long as they weren't permanent structures. That meant I could legally dig a trench around my driveway, as long as I didn't make it permanent. I double-checked. Then triple-checked. Then called a lawyer buddy to confirm. It was solid. And that's when the fun really started. The next morning, I rented an excavator. I hired a few guys from a construction crew. And I gave them one simple instruction: I want a deep, wide trench around my driveway. Not a shallow ditch. A full-blown medieval moat. They thought I was out of my mind, but hey, money talks. By the time the sun went down, my driveway was completely surrounded by a 4-foot-deep trench, wide enough that no vehicle could get past it. The next morning, Karen came storming over, clearly ready to gloat. But the second she laid eyes on her SUV, now stranded in the middle of the trench, her smug look dissolved into sheer horror. "What the hell is this?" she shrieked. "Just a few security upgrades," I replied, barely hiding my grin. "HOA rules say I'm allowed." Karen's eye twitched. "You can't just dig a hole around my car." "Sure I can," I said. "This is my land. And since you wouldn't move, I had to build around you." She looked like her brain had just crashed. "Why you can't? This is illegal." "Nope," I replied, holding up a printed copy of the zoning laws. "Totally legal. In fact, I even got a permit. City approved." Her jaw tightened so much I thought her teeth might crack. "You're going to regret this," she hissed. "The HOA will never allow it." I just shrugged. "Guess we'll find out." Then I turned and walked back inside, leaving her fuming on the edge of the trench. And the best part? That trench was just the beginning. If Karen thought this was the end, she was in for one massive surprise. I had already started designing the next phase, a drawbridge. The following morning, I was greeted by the sound of furious banging on my front door. I didn't even need to check, I knew exactly who it was. Karen stood there, looking like she hadn't slept at all. Her fists were clenched, her eyes wild, and the moment I opened the door, she jabbed a perfectly manicured finger at my chest. "You need to fill that hole in. Right now," she ceded. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring her rage. "Oh, the trench? Yeah, can't do that. It's a fully legal security measure." She let out a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a screech. "You have exactly 24 hours to fix this or I'll make sure the HOA fines you into oblivion." I pretended to consider it for a second. That's interesting. Because I was actually about to start my next upgrade. Her eyes narrowed. "What kind of upgrade?" I grinned. "A drawbridge." Her mouth dropped open, then closed, then opened again like a fish gasping for air. You can't just install a drawbridge in a suburban neighborhood." "Sure I can," I said. I checked. "As long as it's not a permanent gate and qualifies as a temporary structure, it's perfectly allowed. And since you seem so concerned about my driveway, this will make sure it stays safe and secure." Karen looked like she was about to throw something at me, but instead, she stormed off, muttering something about city inspectors, lawsuits, and how I'd regret this. I didn't doubt for a second that she'd do everything in her power to shut me down. But I wasn't worried, I had done my research. And for once, I was actually excited for this fight. Over the next few days, I gathered all the materials I needed and hired a few contractors who knew what they were doing. The best part? I didn't even need anything fancy. Just some reinforced lumber, strong metal hinges, and a pulley system. That was enough to build a working drawbridge. And of course, I recorded everything. Every step. Not just to cover myself legally, but because I had a feeling this would make internet gold. As construction continued, Karen ramped things up. She called in city inspectors, convinced they'd shut me down on the spot. But when they arrived, walked around the site, and saw that everything was perfectly within the legal code, they just shook their heads and left. Karen tried to rally the other homeowners by organizing a petition, but that plan fell flat. Turns out, most of the neighbors were just as tired of her antics as I was. She even attempted to block my contractors from entering the neighborhood, only for that to backfire spectacularly when one of them turned out to be the brother of a city councilman. By the time the drawbridge was finally complete, the entire neighborhood had gathered to watch. And it was beautiful. A solid wooden platform, fully functional, raised and lowered by a simple pulley system. I gave it a test run, pulled the rope, and watched with satisfaction as the bridge lifted clean off the ground, making my driveway completely inaccessible. Karen, of course, lost it. "This is madness. You can't build a medieval fortress in a suburban neighborhood," she screamed. "It's not a fortress," I replied. "It's a security enhancement. HOA rules actually encourage improvements like this." She let out a choked, angry sound and stomped away. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. That night, I was woken by strange noises outside. Peeking through the blinds, I spotted Karen creeping along the edge of the trench with a flashlight in hand, clearly trying to inspect, or more likely sabotage, the drawbridge. I grabbed my phone and hit record. "Looking for something, Karen?" I called out. She spun around so fast she nearly lost her balance. "I was just checking to make sure this thing isn't a safety hazard," she snapped. "You mean trespassing?" I said. "Because that's exactly what it looks like to me." She scowled, then straightened up. "I'm on the HOA board. I have every right to inspect potential violations." "Funny," I said. "Because last I checked, the HOA doesn't own this property. But don't worry, I'll send this video to my lawyer. Might even post it online. Pretty sure people would love to see the HOA president snooping around private land in the middle of the night." Her face drained of color. She didn't say another word, just turned and bolted back to her house. By morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Word of Karen's late-night snooping had spread fast. She tried to spin it, claiming she was just doing her job, but no one believed her. Meanwhile, my story was exploding online. The video of my trench and drawbridge had gone viral, thousands of comments pouring in from people applauding me for standing up to HOA tyranny. Karen must have realized she was losing control because her tactics changed. If she couldn't win through HOA rules, she was going to try to make my life miserable. The fines kept coming, nonsense violations like unauthorized property modifications and complaints about the drawbridge being unsightly. She even got a couple of her loyal HOA followers to file noise complaints, even though construction had ended days ago. But I was ready. What Karen didn't know was that I had been quietly collecting receipts. Emails. Meeting minutes. Expense reports. Everything that showed her abusing her position, including how she was using HOA funds for personal expenses. And guess what? She was sloppy with her paperwork. I gathered it all. Neatly organized. Ready to use when the time was right. And that time? It came faster than I expected. The final showdown began during an emergency. The HOA meeting Karen had called to discuss my so-called violations felt like a setup the moment I walked in. She was already seated at the head of the table, wearing that smug smile like it was a crown. "We've decided your modifications violate community standards," she announced. "You'll need to remove them immediately, or face legal action." I smiled, calm as ever, and placed a thick folder on the table. "That's interesting," I said. "Because I've found a few violations of my own." Karen frowned. "What are you talking about?" I opened the folder and began listing off her offenses: fraudulent fines, misuse of HOA funds, intimidation of homeowners. With each word, her face grew paler. "You're lying," she hissed. "I have proof," I replied. "And I'm more than willing to take it to the authorities." The room went silent. Board members who had once been too afraid to challenge her were suddenly leaning in, curious. Within minutes, a vote was held. Karen was removed as HOA president. By the end of the week, she was under official investigation. That night, I stood on my driveway with a cold drink in hand and watched as Karen's SUV, finally, was towed away. Not by me. By the authorities. What started as a joke, a trench in a drawbridge, had become the perfect trap to expose her corruption. And my driveway had never looked better. For a while, Karen went quiet. Which was unsettling in its own way. She wasn't the type to surrender. Sure enough, the retaliation came. It began with an anonymous complaint about unpermitted construction. Then a surprise inspection from a city official, who chuckled when he saw the drawbridge and left with a shrug after confirming everything was legal. But it didn't stop there. Fake complaints followed, loud noises at night, suspicious activity, and even absurd claims that my trench posed a danger to the neighborhood's infrastructure. I knew exactly who was behind it. Then she crossed the line. One night, I was jolted awake by a crash. I ran to the window, flipped on the outdoor lights. My drawbridge was down, half splintered in the trench. Someone had cut the ropes. I checked the security footage, and there she was. Karen, dressed in black, bolt cutters in hand, crawling around like some low-budget spy. I didn't hesitate. I called the police. She tried to run, but the footage was undeniable. The officers knocked on her door, and moments later, she was handcuffed on her front lawn, screaming about harassment. But no one believed her. The next day, the neighborhood was buzzing. Turns out Karen had made enemies everywhere. People started sharing their own stories of being bullied by her. And with her reputation crumbling, the HOA board called an emergency vote, this time to kick her out entirely. It passed. Unanimously. But that wasn't the end of it. I got an email from a fraud investigator. Apparently, Karen's creative accounting had caught the eye of the authorities. They asked to review the evidence I had presented. I handed it all over, every fake fine, every shady transaction. Within a week, the investigation turned into a legal case. Turns out Karen wasn't just a power-hungry HOA tyrant, she was a scammer. She had been skimming HOA funds for years, using the money for luxury vacations and suspicious offshore accounts. When the news broke, the neighborhood exploded. Someone even put up a free at last banner. Karen's house went up for sale soon after, but no one wanted to buy it. Eventually, she had to sell at a loss and leave town. I watched from the edge of my driveway as she loaded the last of her boxes into a moving truck. She threw me one last glare, but it had no bite. She was finished. I raised my coffee in a silent toast as she drove away. With Karen gone, the HOA board collapsed. Most of the remaining members resigned, and the neighborhood voted to dissolve the HOA entirely. No more fines. No more intimidation. Just peace. For the first time in years, people could breathe again. As for me, I became a bit of a local legend. The story of the trench in the drawbridge spread far and wide. News outlets picked it up. My videos went viral. People from all over started reaching out, asking for advice on dealing with their own HOA nightmares. The drawbridge, now fully repaired, became a permanent fixture. The kids in the neighborhood loved it. They started calling my house Castle Jake. I even added a plaque near the trench that read, "In memory of HOA tyranny." It always made for a good laugh. One night, while I was grilling steaks, my oldest neighbor stopped by. He'd lived there longer than anyone and had watched Karen's reign from the very start. "You know," he said, "I always figured someone would take her down one day. I just didn't expect it to involve a trench and a drawbridge." I laughed. "Sometimes you've gotta get creative." He nodded, watching the sun dip behind the trees. "Well, whatever you did, it worked. This place is better without her." I flipped the steaks, smiled, and said, "Yeah, it really is." And for the first time since I moved in, I felt like I was finally home.